The woman hit the floor before anyone moved. 1 second she was standing, clipboard in hand, calm as stone. And the next, Officer Marcus Kane's forearm had swept everything off the nurse's station, and his finger was 2 inches from her face, shaking with rage. "You think that badge on your scrubs means anything to me?" Nobody intervened. 17 people watched. Not one of them knew that the woman picking herself up off that linoleum floor had once carried wounded soldiers out of a burning vehicle under enemy fire. That she had stitched a man's throat closed with her bare hands in a ditch outside a combat zone. That she had survived things Marcus Kane couldn't dream of in his worst nightmare. He had walked into Mercy Ridge Medical Center looking for someone to punish. He had no idea what he'd just woken up. If this story hits different, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night shift at Mercy Ridge Medical Center had a particular smell. Antiseptic layered over burnt coffee, layered over the kind of exhaustion that settles into a building's walls after years of absorbing other people's worst moments. Evelyn Hayes knew that smell the way she knew her own heartbeat. Familiar, grounding, safe, in the way that only places soaked in hard work could feel safe to someone like her. She was 34 years old, and she had been a trauma nurse for 6 years. Before that, she had been something else entirely, something she didn't discuss, didn't frame on the wall of her apartment, didn't bring up at staff meetings or holiday parties. She had come to Mercy Ridge specifically because it was the kind of place where a person could disappear into the work, big enough to stay anonymous, busy enough to never stop moving. In a mid-sized city called Drayford, 3 hours from anything resembling a coast, where the winters came early and the news cycle moved slow enough that no one had heard of her. That was exactly the point. She kept her head down, did her job with a precision that bordered on unsettling, and went home to a quiet apartment where she read military history books she'd never admit to owning and ate cereal for dinner more nights than not. She wasn't unfriendly, she just didn't need much. The nurses who'd worked with her for years respected her without quite knowing why. There was something in the way she moved through a crisis that made people want to follow her lead, even though she never asked them to. Her supervisor, a broad-shouldered administrator named Director Gerald Holt, had once described her to a colleague as adequate. He meant it as a compliment. Evelyn hadn't corrected him. She was halfway through charting a post-op update when the automatic doors at the ER entrance blew open like something angry was pushing through them. Officer Marcus Kane did not enter rooms. He occupied them. He was 6'2", built like someone who had never stopped trying to prove something, and he wore his Drayford PD uniform like a second skin, the way certain men wore authority, like it was sewn into them rather than issued. He had a wide jaw and eyes that were always slightly too narrow, always scanning for something to push back against. He had a reputation in the department that preceded him the way thunderstorms precede themselves. You felt the pressure change before you saw the lightning. He was also, as of 30 seconds ago, in Evelyn's emergency department. "I need someone to tell me what is happening with my brother," he said. Not loudly. Not yet. That came later. Right now it was the controlled version, the voice that said, "I am being reasonable," but that could change very fast. The triage nurse at the front desk, a young woman named Danny, who had been on shift for 9 hours and looked it, pulled up the intake screen. "Can I get the patient's name?" "Danny Kane. He came in 40 minutes ago. Motorcycle accident." Marcus leaned on the counter with both forearms crowding the space. 40 minutes and nobody's told me a damn thing. "I can check on his status for you, sir. If you could just—" "I don't want you to check. I want someone to talk to me right now." Danny looked up. She was 26 and knew enough that she still flinched at raised voices. "I understand, sir. If you'll give me just get me a doctor. Get me whoever's in charge. Get me someone who can tell me what's happening in that back room." Evelyn heard all of this from the hallway without looking up from her chart. She could read the acoustic signature of a situation deteriorating. Years of working trauma had calibrated her to it. She finished her notation, capped her pen, and walked to the desk. "I'm Nurse Hayes," she said. "I'm the charge nurse on duty tonight. How can I help?" Marcus looked at her the way certain people look at things they've already categorized. His eyes moved from her face to her name badge to her scrubs and back, and in that 2-second sweep, he had clearly decided everything he needed to know about her. Danny Kane, my brother. Motorcycle accident brought in 40 minutes ago. Why hasn't a doctor updated me? Your brother is currently being assessed in Trauma Bay 2. The attending on his case is Dr. Okafor, who is with him right now. The reason you haven't received an update yet is because Dr. Okafor is working. 40 minutes. Yes, that's not an unusual amount of time for initial trauma assessment. Marcus's jaw tightened. I want to speak to whoever's in charge of this hospital tonight. That would be the charge physician, Dr. Okafor, and myself. Not you. He said it flat. No heat, almost. Just the comfortable certainty of someone who had never had to explain that particular sentence before. Someone with authority. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. I have authority over patient care coordination in this department tonight. What I can't authorize is pulling Dr. Okafor from your brother's side to come update you while he's still being worked on. What I can do is get you current information and make sure you're the first person we call the moment there's something to report. That's not good enough. I understand that's frustrating. Don't tell me you understand, Marcus said, and the volume notched up a fraction. 2 nurses near the medication station found reasons to look elsewhere. You don't understand anything. He gestured at her, a dismissive wave like she was furniture in the wrong place. You're a nurse. You're not making decisions here. Evelyn did not look away. I am making decisions here. That is specifically my job. It was the wrong answer, in the sense that it was the answer that made him decide he needed to make an example. She saw it happen, the shift behind his eyes, from irritation to something colder. Get me your supervisor, Marcus said. Director Holt isn't on site tonight. Then whoever is on site, and I want it now. She held his gaze another half-second, then picked up the phone and called the on-call administrator, a man named Barry Sellers who answered on the 4th ring with the voice of someone who had been watching something streaming. She explained the situation in 4 sentences. There was a pause on the line. Barry's voice dropped, took on that particular careful tone of someone calculating risk. Just give him what he needs, Evelyn. He's a police officer. He's asking me to pull the attending from an active trauma assessment. Then, look, just keep him calm. Can you do that? Just keep him calm. She set the phone down. Marcus was watching her. He'd heard enough of it to know what had just happened. Good, he said. So we're clear on how this works. They were not clear on anything, but Evelyn filed that away and went back to doing her job. For the next 20 minutes, she watched him move through the waiting area the way certain people move through spaces they've decided they own. He paced. He checked his phone. He questioned 2 different nurses about his brother's status, both of whom gave the same answer she had given. Dr. Okafor is still with him, we'll update you. And both of whom got a version of the same response she'd gotten. Danny Kane's injury was a dislocated shoulder, 2 cracked ribs, and road rash bad enough to require significant cleaning and debridement. Painful. Serious looking, but not life-threatening. Dr. Okafor was being thorough. When Marcus pushed open the door to the trauma bay without knocking, Evelyn was already moving. Sir, you can't be in here. He's my brother. He's a patient in an active treatment space. She was in the doorway, blocking without blocking, positioning without being a wall, the kind of thing you learned when you needed people to comply without giving them something to push against. You can see him the moment Dr. Okafor is finished. That is 10 minutes, maybe less. Dr. Okafor looked up from where he was working on Danny's shoulder. He was a quiet man, methodical, and he didn't like scenes. He gave Evelyn a look that said, handle this. Marcus. Danny Kane's voice from the table, a younger version of his brother, slimmer, looking shaken and exhausted. Just wait outside, I'm fine. You don't look fine. I'm fine. Let them finish. Marcus looked at his brother, then at Evelyn, then at Dr. Okafor, and there was something in that look, a particular kind of resentment that comes from being unable to find a target for your helplessness. Fine, he said, and he walked out. She thought for a moment that it was over. She was wrong. Director Holt arrived at 11:15, which was a surprise. Barry must have called him after she'd hung up, because nobody had told Evelyn he was coming. Holt was a heavy-set man in his 50s, who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke in complete paragraphs and had, in Evelyn's 6 years at Mercy Ridge, never once set foot in the ER after 9 o'clock on a weeknight. He found her at the central station and said quietly, "Give me a moment." They stepped into the supply corridor, which smelled like latex and bleach. "Officer Kane called the hospital board directly," Holt said. Evelyn looked at him. "He said you were obstructing his access to his brother's medical information and that you were dismissive of a Drayford PD officer in an active," he used the phrase active welfare situation. "I don't know what that means." "It means he wanted to pull the attending physician from a trauma assessment, and I told him no." Holt took his glasses off and cleaned them, which was what he did when he was uncomfortable. "His brother is a patient here. His brother is stable and was treated appropriately. Dr. Okafor was with him start to finish." "I understand that." Holt put his glasses back on. "But Officer Kane has relationships in this city, Evelyn. He's connected to the precinct command, and the city council liaison has called the board chair twice in the last year about hospital funding for the emergency response partnership. And I just..." He stopped. "I need you to step back from this case." The corridor was very quiet. "Step back," she said, "from the Kane case. Let Dr. Okafor handle any communication with the family. You can cover the rest of the floor, everything else is yours, but I need... You're telling me to remove myself because a police officer complained about receiving standard protocol care for his brother." Holt looked at the floor. "I'm asking you to make this simpler." She held the silence for 3 seconds. 4. Long enough that Holt looked up. "Okay," she said, and she walked back to the floor. Marcus found her 20 minutes later at the nurse's station, and the volume was gone now. He was past the point of performing. He was just angry in the way that people are angry when they've gotten everything they wanted, and they're still angry. "You think scrubs make you important?" The station went quiet. Danny, 2 feet away, did not look up. "I don't think anything about importance," Evelyn said. "I think about patient care." "You know what I think?" He was close enough now that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "I think you held up my brother's treatment to prove something, some little power play." "Your brother's treatment was not held up. He was assessed, stabilized, and treated in under 45 minutes for a multi-point trauma presentation. That's fast. Don't quote me numbers. I'm going to continue to do my job, Officer Kane." "Your job?" He said it like something he was deciding whether to throw away. "You know what your job is? It's exactly what I say it is in exactly this city. Because I know this hospital, and I know this administration, and I know what happens to nurses who make themselves difficult." He leaned slightly forward. "So I'm going to ask you one more time to get me someone above you who can answer my questions properly." The thing about moments like this, Evelyn had learned, was that they happened in slow time. The air in a room compressed slightly right before something irreversible occurred. She'd felt it in other places, other situations, in other countries, in other kinds of darkness. And the body's response was always the same. A strange clarity. Not calm, exactly. Clarity. She opened her mouth to respond. The ambulance bay doors exploded open. It wasn't one vehicle. It was 3 rigs and a fire department transport, all arriving inside 90 seconds of each other, and the radio traffic that had been crackling in the background for the last 10 minutes suddenly snapped into focus. "Mercy Ridge, this is Medic 7. We are inbound with 4 critical and 6 serious multi-vehicle collision on Route 9 overpass, tractor trailer versus 4 passenger vehicles. Additional units behind us." The ER, which had been managing a moderately busy Tuesday night, detonated into a different mode entirely. Evelyn was already moving before the second rig cleared the bay, the kind of movement that bypassed the part of the brain that decides. It was simply the next step, and then the next, and then the body already knew where it was going. "Danny, I need all available trauma bays cleared and prepped. Get me Dr. Okafor and whoever else is on call. I need them suited and standing now." She hit the intercom without slowing. "Overhead page, mass casualty protocol, all available trauma staff to ER. This is not a drill." She met the first paramedics at the bay door. Male, mid-40s, blunt force thoracic trauma, responsive but labored breathing. She did a 15-second assessment that would have taken a less practiced person 3 minutes. She pointed. Bay 1, right now. The second gurney, young woman, head lack, suspected internal bleeding, BP dropping. Bay 3, O negative on standby. Third, child, maybe 9 years old, arm fracture and facial lacerations, frightened but alert. She put a hand on the boy's arm, just for a second, just long enough to register. You're okay, she said, and meant it specifically enough that his breathing slowed. Bay 4, pediatric kit. Behind her, she heard Marcus Kane's voice, and for a moment she thought he was going to keep going, keep pushing, keep performing whatever this was. But when she turned, she saw something different on his face. He was watching her, really watching her, maybe for the first time. The waiting area was filling, staff were moving in every direction. 2 nurses were frozen near the medication station, overwhelmed by the volume, and Dr. Okafor was looking at the intake board with an expression that bordered on panicked. There were too many patients, too many needs, too many decisions arriving simultaneously. Evelyn stepped to the center of the floor. Listen up, she said. Not loudly. She'd never been loud exactly. It was more that her voice had a frequency that cut through noise the way certain tones cut through static. Dr. Okafor has thoracic and internal priority in bays 1 and 3. Dr. Summers, pediatric and orthopedic in bay 4. All other attending physicians are triage and stabilize until we can move upstairs. I need 2 nurses at the intake door running secondary assessment on everyone coming off those rigs. Danny, Marcus, she stopped, looked at the large police officer standing in the middle of the floor, who had somehow not moved despite everything happening around him. You, she said. She didn't add, sir. You either help or you clear the floor. Those are the options. Something moved across Marcus Kane's face that she didn't have time to identify. What do you need? He said. It was, by a significant margin, the most surprising sentence she'd heard all night. There's a family coming in behind the rigs. At least 3 vehicles with walking wounded who drove themselves. They'll be terrified and untreated. I need someone at the front entrance directing them to intake triage and keeping the access lane clear for the next ambulance. Marcus stared at her for one long second. Then he walked to the front entrance. For the next 47 minutes, Mercy Ridge Emergency Department ran at a level of coordinated intensity that it had not achieved in years, possibly ever, on a shift this understaffed. Evelyn moved through it like a current, visible without being a spectacle, present at every critical decision point without monopolizing any of them. She stabilized a man who had begun coding during transfer. She talked a terrified resident through his first independent surgical prep. She found the failing crash cart, the one she'd noticed earlier when Marcus had been shouting, the equipment that had been malfunctioning, and swapped it before it could cost them anything. At one point, Dr. Okafor looked up from a procedure and said quietly, "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. "Done what?" she said, already moving to the next bay. He watched her go. At 12:40, the last critical patient was stabilized and transferred to the ICU. The ER had absorbed 10 serious and 4 critical cases in under an hour. Nobody had died in the department. Evelyn was at the station writing her incident log when she became aware of something outside the ambulance bay windows. Black vehicles. Not police cruisers. Not city vehicles. SUVs with federal plates, the kind with extra antennas on the roof. 4 of them, parked in a formation that wasn't accidental. She kept writing. The ER entrance opened again, and the people who came through it were not paramedics and not hospital staff. 4 of them in dark jackets, badges visible. Not Drayford PD, something with federal insignia. Behind them, a man in a military service uniform with enough commendations on his chest that several of the nurses stopped what they were doing just to look. They moved through the department with the specific calm purposefulness of people who had been here before. Not to this room, but to this type of situation. Looking for something, or someone. Marcus Kane straightened when he saw them. His hand moved toward his badge instinctively. His face rearranged itself into the expression of a man who assumed authority would recognize him. The group walked past him without slowing. They stopped in front of the nurses' station, in front of Evelyn. The man in the uniform looked at her with the expression of someone who had been looking for a person and had found them at last. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said. The ER, which had been returning slowly to its normal rhythm, the clattering and beeping and low professional murmur of a department coming down from crisis, went completely, perfectly silent. "We need your statement on the events of tonight," the man continued, "and your identification in relation to a federal investigation that's been ongoing for the last several months." Danny looked at Evelyn. Dr. Okafor looked at Evelyn. The entire room looked at Evelyn. She set her pen down on the incident log, precisely in the middle of the page. Marcus Kane, standing 15 feet away, was doing something Evelyn had not seen him do once all night. He was standing completely still. His hand had stopped moving toward his badge. His face had drained of its particular brand of occupying certainty, replaced with something that looked for the first time like confusion. She looked at the commander. "Give me 5 minutes to hand off the floor," she said. He nodded, once. She picked up her radio, called Dr. Okafor's name, and began the handoff with the same even efficiency she brought to everything else. And across the room, Marcus Kane stood in the emergency department where he had shoved things off counters and pointed fingers and told a nurse her job was whatever he said it was, stood there watching federal agents settle in around the perimeter of the room like they had no intention of leaving anytime soon. The night was a long way from over. The handoff took 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which was faster than standard protocol and still felt like too long. Evelyn walked Dr. Okafor through the remaining actives. Bay 1 still needed a second assessment on the thoracic patient's oxygen levels. Bay 3's internal bleed case was stable but needed monitoring every 15 minutes, and the 9-year-old in Bay 4 had a pediatric consult coming down from the 3rd floor who needed to be met at the elevator. She gave him all of it in the flat, sequential language of someone transferring a file, not a crisis. And Dr. Okafor accepted it with the slightly stunned compliance of a man who had just watched a person he thought he knew become someone else entirely. "I'll be in the conference room off the main corridor," she told him. "If Bay 1's O2 drops below 92, come get me regardless." "Evelyn." He said her name like a question he wasn't sure how to finish. 15-minute checks on Bay 3, she repeated and walked toward the corridor. The commander. His name was Whitfield. He'd said it briefly when she'd asked, Colonel James Whitfield, with a formality that suggested he was used to people not needing to ask, was waiting near the corridor entrance with 2 of his people flanking him and the 2 federal agents positioned near the ER entrance in a way that blocked it without looking like they were blocking it. Small details, but the kind that told you a lot about how a situation was being managed. They weren't here to make a scene, they were here to contain one. Evelyn noted all of it and said nothing. The conference room was a beige 12x12 box that smelled like dry erase marker, and the particular kind of stale air that collected in rooms used for bad news. There was a table, 6 chairs, a whiteboard with a half-erased supply meeting agenda from 3 weeks ago. One of Whitfield's people set a recording device on the table, small, digital, the kind that picked up a whisper at 30 feet, and took the chair nearest the door. Whitfield sat across from her. He was in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that had been weathered past attractiveness into something more interesting. Planes and angles, eyes that measured distances without appearing to. He put a folder on the table but didn't open it. "You want water?" he said. "I'm fine." "You've been on your feet for..." He glanced at his watch. "Looks like 11 hours. 12 and a half. I'm fine." He looked at her for a moment. Not the way Marcus Kane had looked at her, cataloging and dismissing. More like someone checking alignment, making sure the person in front of him matched the file he'd been carrying for the last several months. "How much do you know about Operation Cloverline?" he asked. "Nothing." "That's what we expected." He opened the folder. "You were at Fort Delancey from 2013 to 2018 as a combat medic attached to the 74th Forward Support Battalion. You did 2 deployments. The second one ended with a medical discharge following..." He paused. "An incident. You have my file." "We have your file?" He didn't belabor it. "What we didn't have, what we've been working to reconstruct for the past 8 months, is the supply chain, the one that started in theater and ended up here." Evelyn looked at him. "Here. Drayford, Mercy Ridge, specifically." He pulled a photograph from the folder and set it on the table. A black and white surveillance image, not high resolution, showing a loading dock. She recognized it. South side of the hospital, near the pharmaceutical delivery entrance. A spot she walked past twice a shift. 3 months ago, an audit at Fort Delancey flagged a 6-year discrepancy in controlled substance inventory. Ketamine, fentanyl, several others. The audit trail leads to a distribution network that moved product through civilian medical facilities in 4 cities. He tapped the photo. Drayford is the hub. She looked at the photograph. And Mercy Ridge is the through point. She sat with that for a moment. She'd been moving through this building for 6 years, eating bad cafeteria food and charting until 2 in the morning and watching people die and watching people live. And underneath all of it, apparently, completely undetected by her, something else had been running entirely. "What does this have to do with tonight?" she said. Whitfield pulled out a second photograph. This one she recognized immediately because the face in it was someone she'd treated twice in the last year, a man named Roy Haskell, a repeat patient who'd come in with what was charted as chronic back pain. Late 40s, always slightly evasive, always paying cash. "Roy Haskell," she said. Whitfield's eyes sharpened a fraction. "You know him. Treated him. Twice, maybe 3 times. Chronic pain presentation, nothing that flagged. Roy Haskell is a mid-level distributor in the Cloverline network. Tonight's crash on Route 9 wasn't entirely accidental. One of the vehicles involved belongs to a courier connected to the network. The crash happened when a handoff went wrong." He set a third photograph next to the second one. "The driver of the tractor trailer is one of ours, undercover. He called in the incident after the handoff was interrupted, and we deployed." He leaned back slightly. "We didn't know you were here until we ran the hospital staff roster 2 hours ago, and your name came up." "Why does my name matter?" He was quiet for a second. It was the specific quiet of someone deciding how much to say. "Because of what you witnessed during your second deployment," he said. "There was a supply discrepancy flagged at your forward operating base in 2017. You reported it to your chain of command. The report was buried." The air in the room didn't change exactly, but something in Evelyn's chest did. A small, cold recognition, like finding something you'd shoved in a drawer years ago and assumed was gone. "I was told it was a clerical error," she said. "It wasn't a clerical error. It was the beginning of what became Cloverline, and the officer who buried your report." Whitfield turned over the last photograph in his folder and slid it across the table. "Was Captain David Kane, retired, currently operating a logistics company in Drayford, and the father of officers Marcus and Daniel Kane." The photograph sat between them on the table. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to. She'd already seen the face clearly enough. An older version of Marcus, the same jaw, the same quality of occupying the frame. He was in uniform in the photo, standing in front of a vehicle she recognized as standard forward operating base logistics. He looked like someone very comfortable with where he was standing. "Daniel Kane," she said slowly. "The patient tonight. The motorcycle accident." "The motorcycle accident that happened 6 blocks from a documented handoff location," Whitfield said. "Danny Kane has been running street-level logistics for the network for at least 18 months. We believe tonight's handoff was product coming through the hospital pharmaceutical system. Someone on staff, not yet identified, has been flagging certain deliveries for diversion." He paused. "The timing of Marcus Kane's appearance here tonight may have been coincidence." "Or it wasn't." "Or it wasn't," he agreed, "which is why I need to understand everything that happened from the moment he arrived until the moment we walked in." So she told him. She was precise about it. She had a good memory for the things that happened in sequence, another thing you learned in certain environments, the ability to reconstruct events without editorializing. She told him about Marcus's arrival, the confrontation at the desk, the call to Barry Sellers, the corridor conversation with Director Holt, the order to step back from the case. She told him about the moment Marcus pushed open the trauma bay door. She told him about the escalation at the nurse's station, the things he'd said, the physical proximity. And she told him about the mass casualty event and what Marcus had done, or more precisely, what he had done after she'd asked him to. Whitfield listened without interrupting. His colleague near the door was taking notes. When she finished, Whitfield was quiet for a moment. He directed family members to triage, he said, for about 20 minutes. Then I lost track of him in the chaos. We know where he was. Whitfield glanced at his colleague, who pulled out a tablet and turned it so she could see. Surveillance footage, hospital security cameras, she realized, which meant they'd gotten access to the hospital system before they'd even walked in the front door. The footage showed Marcus in the corridor outside the trauma bays, near the pharmaceutical supply access, for approximately 11 minutes during the peak of the mass casualty response. That's the diversion corridor, she said. Yes. He knew the crash was coming. She said it quietly, following the logic the way you followed a suture line, stitch by stitch. Or he knew something was happening tonight involving his brother, and he positioned himself here in case things needed to be managed, Whitfield supplied. She looked at the footage. Marcus, pacing in that corridor, checking his phone twice, looking over his shoulder once. Looking, she now understood, like a man waiting for something to resolve itself. The crash interrupted whatever was supposed to happen, she said. We believe so. When the mass casualty response activated, the hospital locked down its secondary access and the diversion window closed. Whitfield took the tablet back. The person on staff who was supposed to facilitate the handoff couldn't access the supply corridor in time, which means the product is still in the building. The words landed in the room and sat there. Still in the building. Somewhere in Mercy Ridge Medical Center at 1:15 in the morning, in one of the supply corridors or medication rooms or locked pharmaceutical cabinets that Evelyn had walked past 1,000 times, there was something that a federal investigation had been tracking for 8 months. Something that had started, she now understood, with a report she had written 7 years ago in a forward operating base that someone had decided wasn't important enough to pursue. She thought about what it felt like back then to write that report, the careful language she'd used, the specific inventory numbers, the chain of custody documentation she'd done herself because she'd wanted it to be airtight. She'd been 27. She'd trusted the process. What do you need from me? She said. Your knowledge of the building, Whitfield said. The pharmacy staff rotation, the secondary access points, which supply corridors are monitored versus unmonitored. You know this facility better than anyone we have access to at this hour. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. And your cooperation in keeping this quiet until we've secured the material and identified the staff contact. You don't want Marcus to know what you know. Not yet. Not until we have everything. She looked at her hands on the table for a moment. They were still. They were always still, which was a thing people found unnerving about her, the absence of the small nervous movements that most people performed unconsciously. There's something you should know, she said, before we go further. Whitfield waited. Director Holt, the administrator who told me to step back from the Kane case tonight. She kept her voice even. He has sign-off authority on all pharmaceutical deliveries above a certain threshold. Has for the past 4 years. She paused. I don't know what that means for your investigation. I'm not accusing him of anything. But you said you haven't identified the staff contact, and you should probably know that. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, We know about Holt. She went back to the floor at 1:32. It was the strangest kind of normal, the ER coming down from the adrenaline of the mass casualty response, staff cleaning up, the overhead lights feeling too bright after an hour of crisis intensity. Dr. Okafor met her near the station and gave her a quick status update on the remaining actives, which she listened to with full attention because the patients didn't stop being patients, because the federal government was currently running a secondary operation in the building she worked in. Bay 1's thoracic patient had stabilized. Bay 3 was cleared to step down. The 9-year-old was upstairs with his mother in pediatric observation, arm set, sleeping. Good, she said. Thank you. Okafor was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her since the federal agents had walked in. She understood the look. It was the particular expression of someone realizing that a person they thought they knew was a set of nested containers, and they'd only ever seen the outside. Are you in trouble? He said. No. Because if you're in... I'm not in trouble, Kwame. She used his first name without thinking about it, which she almost never did, and saw something shift in his face. I promise. Go check on your thoracic patient. He went. She pulled up the pharmaceutical inventory system on the station terminal, moving slowly enough to look like routine post-incident documentation, and began running the numbers that Whitfield had asked her to pull. Controlled substance logs for the last 30 days. Delivery records against dispensing records. The kind of audit she'd never had reason to run before, and which now, looking at the columns in front of her, showed a pattern that was not subtle once you knew what to look for. Small variances. Never large enough to trigger an automatic flag. The kind of thing that looked like data entry errors, rounding differences, the normal noise of a busy department. Except they appeared on the same 3 days every month, always aligned with the Tuesday night shift, always in the fentanyl and ketamine columns. Tonight was Tuesday. She was printing the last 30 days of logs when she heard Marcus Kane's voice from near the entrance. He was talking on his phone, low enough that she shouldn't have been able to hear him, but the ER was quiet enough at this hour that sound traveled differently. She couldn't make out words. She could make out tone. And the tone was not the controlled anger of a man asserting authority. It was something more compressed, urgent. He hung up and stood for a moment with his hand still on the phone, looking at nothing. Then he looked at the corridor that led toward the secondary pharmaceutical access. She watched him from the station. He took 2 steps in that direction, then stopped, looked over his shoulder. His eyes found her, and for a moment they were just looking at each other across the ER floor. She with the printed logs in her hand, he with his hand still half raised toward a corridor he apparently thought he needed to get to. Something passed between them. She wasn't sure what he saw in her face. She kept it neutral, which had always come naturally to her. But something in his expression shifted. A recalibration. The kind that happened when a person suddenly felt uncertain about a situation they'd thought they controlled. He turned away from the corridor. He sat down in one of the waiting chairs near the entrance, and he stayed there. 3 minutes later, 2 of Whitfield's federal agents moved down the corridor that Marcus had been looking at. They were quiet about it. Nobody watching from the waiting area would have clocked it as significant. Just 2 people in jackets walking down a hallway. Her radio crackled softly. Whitfield's voice, barely above a murmur. "We've got the secondary access covered. How's the floor?" She turned slightly away from the waiting area and said quietly, "Quiet. For now." "Stay visible," he said. "Act normal." She almost told him she was acting exactly like herself, which was normal, and the distinction mattered, but this wasn't the moment. She folded the pharmaceutical logs, put them in her scrub pocket, and went to check on Bay 1. The thoracic patient in Bay 1 was a man named Gerald Frakes, 51, who had been driving one of the passenger vehicles in the Route 9 crash. He was awake now, the particular groggy but returning awareness of someone coming through pain medication. He had a thick neck and a carpenter's hands and a wedding ring that had been cut off during the emergency response and placed in a small, labeled bag on the bedside table. "How you feeling?" Evelyn asked. "Like I got hit by a truck," he said. Then he seemed to realize something. You were in a collision. You're at Mercy Ridge. Your injuries are serious, but you're stable." She checked his vitals on the monitor, adjusted his IV flow. "Is there someone we should call for you?" "My wife." He gave her a number. His voice was the voice of a man trying to hold himself together and mostly succeeding. "Is everyone okay? The other cars?" "I can't give you information on other patients," she said. "But I can tell you that everyone who came in tonight received care." Which was true, even if it wasn't an answer. Sometimes truth and answer were different things. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I saw there was something on the truck before it hit. I need to tell somebody that." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The truck came across the median like the driver turned into it on purpose." His brow was furrowed, working through the memory. "Not like a blowout, not like he lost control. He turned the wheel. I saw his face right before." He stopped. "I need to tell the police." "There are law enforcement personnel in the building," she said carefully. "I'll make sure someone speaks to you." She noted it on his chart, left the bay, and walked to the corridor where she'd last seen Whitfield. He was standing near the supply room door, speaking quietly with his colleague. When she appeared, he looked at her. "Gerald Frakes, Bay 1, she said, quietly and fast. He's saying the tractor-trailer driver turned into the median deliberately. He saw his face." Whitfield and his colleague exchanged a look. Our guy, his colleague said. The undercover driver, Evelyn said. Not a question. He had reason to believe the handoff tonight involved something beyond product. We're still putting together what that means. Whitfield glanced at the supply room door. We found the storage point. It's a false panel in the secondary medication cabinet, the one installed during the 2022 renovation. Sophisticated. Someone with facility knowledge set it up. The 2022 renovation was overseen by administration, she said. Holt signed off on every contractor. We know. He looked at her. You've been busy. I printed the last 30 days of controlled substance logs. She took the folded papers from her pocket and handed them to him. Tuesday night variances. Same columns, same pattern, 30-day cycle. He took the papers, looked at the top sheet, and didn't speak for a long moment. Lieutenant, he said, and then seemed to catch himself. Ms. Hayes, you understand that what you're handing me changes the shape of tonight considerably. Good, she said. She walked back to the floor. At 2:40 in the morning, Director Gerald Holt arrived at Mercy Ridge for the second time that night. He was dressed properly this time, not the slightly wrinkled version of himself that had appeared after Barry's call. He was in a full suit, which at 2:40 in the morning was either a sign of extreme professionalism or extreme anxiety, and in Holt's case, she was beginning to understand it was the second. He came through the main entrance with his reading glasses already on, and his phone in his hand and his eyes moving across the ER floor with the rapid scan of a man looking for something specific. His eyes landed on Marcus Kane in the waiting area first. Something passed between them, not words, just a look that had enough weight in it to confirm something she'd been adding up all night. Then his eyes found her. He crossed the floor with the careful pace of someone who wanted to look unhurried. Evelyn, I heard about tonight. The mass casualty response? Are we on top of everything? Medically, yes. All critical patients stabilized and transferred. And He glanced toward the corridor where the federal agents had gone. I was informed there are federal personnel on site. Colonel Whitfield and his team, yes, they're conducting an investigation. What kind of investigation? She looked at him. You'd have to ask Colonel Whitfield. Holt's eyes narrowed fractionally. He took one step closer, dropping his voice. Evelyn, I need to understand what's been said in this building tonight. Whatever conversation you had with those people. Director Holt. She said it the way she said everything. Level, no inflection that could be read. I'm going to need you to talk to Colonel Whitfield directly. He's in the secondary corridor. She paused. He's been expecting you. Holt's face did something complicated. Expecting me, he repeated. Since about 1:30, I think. She saw it happen. The moment a person's constructed version of a situation collapsed, and the real version came in behind it. Holt's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recalculation, and then something she could only describe as the expression of a man who had just understood that a door he thought was open was, in fact, very much closed. He straightened his jacket, an involuntary gesture, straightening something that couldn't be straightened. I see, he said. He walked toward the secondary corridor. Evelyn watched him go. Then she turned back to the station and picked up where she'd left off on her incident documentation, because the work was still the work regardless of everything else, and the patients in this building needed someone thinking about them. Danny appeared beside her 20 minutes later, setting a paper cup of coffee on the station without being asked. It was terrible coffee, vending machine quality, the kind that tasted like hot brown disappointment. Evelyn drank it. Are you going to tell me what's happening? Danny said. No. Is it bad? It's complicated. Are we in trouble? Like the hospital? Evelyn looked at her. Danny was 26 and had been awake for 11 hours and had handled an extraordinary night with more composure than her age generally allowed. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her ponytail had mostly escaped its elastic, and she was holding her own terrible coffee with both hands like it was the last warm thing in a cold world. You're not in trouble, Evelyn said. None of the clinical staff are. Danny exhaled slowly. Okay. A pause. They called you lieutenant. Yes. You were in the military. For a while. Another pause, this one longer. Is that why you're like... Danny made a gesture that seemed to mean the way you are, which was vague, but not entirely inaccurate. Probably partly, Evelyn said. Danny nodded slowly, apparently deciding that was sufficient. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Officer Kane hasn't moved from that chair in like 45 minutes. Evelyn looked across the ER. Marcus was still in the waiting area chair, and he had the appearance of a man who had started the night at 120 miles per hour and had now, for reasons he didn't fully understand, been forced to idle. His phone was face down on the chair beside him. His hands were clasped between his knees. He was looking at the middle distance, and he had the particular quality of stillness that came not from calm, but from having run out of moves and not yet knowing it. She wondered what he was thinking. Then she decided it didn't matter, went back to the incident log and finished it. At 3:20, the second shift supervisor arrived early, and Evelyn gave her the floor with a clean handoff. All actives documented, all pending consultations noted, the pediatric patient upstairs flagged for morning rounds. Normal, thorough, professional. The kind of handoff that gave the incoming supervisor nothing to worry about. She was at her locker in the staff room, changing out of her scrubs, when the door opened and Whitfield appeared. He knocked once on the open door even though she was already looking at him. "We've got the material secured," he said. "Evidence team is working the supply cabinet now. We also have a second location. Holt identified a storage unit registered under a shell company that we're accessing tonight." She pulled on her jacket. "Holt told you." Holt understood his position. Whitfield came far enough into the room to let the door close behind him. "He's been cooperative for the last hour." "And Marcus?" "We've been watching him. He made 3 calls in the waiting room. We have records of all 3. 2 to his father, 1 to a number registered to an associate we've been tracking in connection with the distribution network." He paused. "He doesn't know what we have yet. He knows something is wrong, and he doesn't know how wrong." "When will you arrest him?" "Once the scene is fully secured and we have confirmation on the storage unit." He looked at her steadily. "It'll happen before morning, I can promise you that." She zipped her bag. "I'm not the one who needs promises." "No," he said. "You're the one who handed me a 30-day variance log that closed a gap we've been working on for 6 months." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you reported this the first time, in 2017. I've read your report. The original one, not the one that was filed. I want you to know it was a complete and accurate piece of documentation. It should have gone somewhere." She looked at her locker door for a moment. There was a small photograph taped to the inside. Faded, a group of people in desert uniforms, squinting against sunlight somewhere that no longer existed. She'd been meaning to take it down for years. "It didn't," she said. "No, it didn't." He didn't add anything to that, which she respected. She closed the locker. "I need to give you a formal statement," she said. "A full one. Not just tonight. The 2017 report, the chain of command, what I was told, all of it." "We'd like that, yes." "Not tonight. Tomorrow. If you're willing, we can do it properly." "I'm willing." She picked up her bag. She was going to walk out of the staff room, through the ER, past the waiting area, and out the main entrance. She was going to drive home in the dark to her apartment with the military history books and the cereal and the photograph she'd been meaning to take down. And she was going to sleep because she'd been awake for 15 hours, and her body was finally making that known. She was not going to think about Marcus Kane in the waiting chair, or David Kane in a photograph, or the report she'd written at 27 that someone had decided wasn't worth pursuing. She was going to sleep. She walked out of the staff room and through the ER, and she kept her eyes forward, and she was almost to the main entrance when Marcus Kane stood up from the waiting chair. "Hayes?" She stopped. Not because she had to, because she chose to. He was standing 6 feet away, and he looked different from the man who had arrived 7 hours ago. Not smaller, exactly. Something had been taken off him. Not removed cleanly, but scraped away, leaving something underneath that was less sure of itself and more human for it. His eyes were tired, and there was something working behind them that might have been, if she was being generous, the beginning of understanding. "My brother," he said, "is he—" Danny was treated and released at approximately 11:45. His injuries were not life-threatening. He was discharged to his own care. She said it with the same level precision she'd used all night. "He's fine, Officer Kane." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. There were things moving in his face that she didn't have time to anatomize. Regret, maybe, or something adjacent to it. Something that had no business coming out of him at 3:20 in the morning in an ER waiting room after the night they'd both had, and was coming out anyway. He stopped. Started again. "Tonight. The way You should talk to a lawyer," she said quietly, "before you say anything else to anyone." His eyes changed. She watched the thing that had been opening close again. The brief, involuntary exposure of something almost human shuddered behind the old default, which was the expression of a man who dealt with things by deciding he was above them. Except this time, it didn't quite work. The expression sat wrong on his face, like a mask that no longer fit quite right. She walked past him to the main entrance. She pushed through the doors into the cold Drayford night, and the air hit her face, damp, smelling like rain that hadn't arrived yet. And she walked to her car in the staff parking lot and unlocked it, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. Her hands were on the wheel, still, as always. She thought about the 9-year-old boy in Bay 4, sleeping upstairs with his arms set and his mother beside him. She thought about Gerald Frakes and his cut-off wedding ring in a labeled bag. She thought about the 30-day log with its tidy columns of quiet theft, passing through the system for years with no one looking at it the right way. She started the car. She was halfway out of the parking lot when her phone lit up on the passenger seat. She glanced at it without stopping. The text was from a number she didn't recognize. No name, just a number with a 615 area code she didn't know. They found the second location, it read, but they didn't find everything. Someone moved half the inventory 3 days ago. "We need to talk." She pulled to a stop at the parking lot exit. "Read it again." The staff lot was empty and dark, and the rain that had been promising itself all night had started to fall, thin and cold, on her windshield. 3 feet away, beyond the lot fence, a Drayford PD cruiser was parked on the street. Routine presence, nothing notable. Except that when she looked at it, the officer in the driver's seat was looking at his phone with an attention that had the particular quality of someone waiting for a response. She looked back at her own phone, then at the cruiser, then at the text. Someone had her personal number. Someone who knew what Whitfield's team had found tonight and what they hadn't. Someone who wanted her to know that the story she thought was closing was not, in fact, anywhere close to over. The rain came down harder. The cruiser didn't move. She put the phone face down on the seat and sat in the dark for a long moment with her hands on the wheel, and the steadiness that had carried her through the night did not waver. But underneath it, something had shifted. Some calculation had changed. She made a decision. She put the car in reverse, went back into the parking lot, and walked back into the hospital. The ER entrance registered her return with the same automatic indifference it registered everyone. A cold blast of recycled air, the overhead lights that never dimmed, the low-grade hum of a building that never actually slept. The second shift supervisor, a compact woman named Renata, looked up from the station with an expression that said she was too tired to ask questions but was asking them internally. "Forgot something," Evelyn said, which was not exactly a lie. She walked past the station, past the waiting area where Marcus Kane's chair was now empty. He'd gone somewhere in the 3 minutes she'd been in the parking lot, and that fact registered as important, and continued down the main corridor toward the secondary access wing where Whitfield had been operating. The corridor was empty. The door to the secondary medication room was closed, and there was no sound from behind it, which meant the evidence team was either finished or had moved their operation elsewhere. She pushed the door open. Empty. The false panel in the cabinet standing open. The interior hollow where product had sat for an unknown number of months, looking like a missing tooth. Evidence markers on the floor. The particular clinical aftermath of a search. She pulled out her phone and looked at the text again. They found the second location, but they didn't find everything. "Someone moved half the inventory 3 days ago. We need to talk." Whoever sent this knew the search had already happened, which meant they were either inside the building or had a source inside the building. And they knew her personal number, which was not listed anywhere, not on any hospital directory, not on any public record. She had been careful about that for 6 years, for reasons she'd never had to explain to anyone. She thought about the cruiser in the parking lot. the officer's eyes on his phone. She walked back to the main corridor and found Whitfield near the ambulance bay, standing with his colleague and a third person she hadn't seen before. A woman in a dark jacket, younger, with a tablet tucked under her arm and the alert posture of someone who had not been awake for 15 hours. "Someone texted me," Evelyn said and showed him the phone. Whitfield read the message. His expression didn't change exactly, but something tightened in his jaw. He showed it to his colleague, who showed it to the woman with the tablet. 615 area code, his colleague said. Nashville-based. Or spoofed, the woman with the tablet said. She had a clipped, efficient way of speaking that suggested she'd had this particular type of conversation before. "How would they have this number?" "I don't know," Evelyn said. "That's the problem." Whitfield handed the phone back. "Did you respond?" "No." "Good." He looked at the woman with the tablet. "Run it." The woman stepped away, already dialing. Whitfield looked at Evelyn. "The cruiser you noticed in the lot. Describe the position." "North side of the staff lot fence, street side. Driver's seat occupied, engine on." The officer was on his phone when I looked at him and was still on his phone a full minute later, which is a long time to be stationary. "Could be routine." "Could be. But the timing, I know." He said it the way people said things when they'd already arrived at a conclusion and were deciding whether to say it out loud. "We have a problem with the scope of this operation. Dryford PD was not looped in tonight for reason. The Kane connection goes higher than Marcus. His father had 2 years of department contacts before his retirement. We don't know which officers knew what." He paused. "We brought our own security, but we can't control the perimeter indefinitely." "You think there's someone in the department running interference?" "I think that's a reasonable concern, yes." She looked at the ambulance bay doors, reinforced glass, the parking lot visible through them, the rain now falling steadily. "The text said someone moved half the inventory 3 days ago. If that's accurate, your secured evidence tonight is partial. Someone knew you were coming. Or got lucky." But he didn't say it like he believed it. Who knew about tonight's operation inside Dryford? He was quiet for long enough that she understood the answer was either complicated or uncomfortable. The undercover driver's activation was a local call. His handler is attached to the Regional Narcotics Task Force, Joint Federal Local, which means there were 3 Dryford PD officers with knowledge of the general operation, not the specifics. 3 officers. She let that sit. And Marcus Kane arrived at this hospital tonight before the crash happened, 40 minutes before. Which means someone tipped him. Whitfield's jaw tightened again. This time, he didn't try to hedge it. "Yes, Ikai." The woman with the tablet came back from around the corner at a near jog, which Evelyn noted because nothing about her manner previously had suggested she moved at anything other than controlled speed. "The number is registered to a prepaid device purchased in Nashville 8 months ago," she said. "But we got a ping on its current location." She turned the tablet so Whitfield could see. A map. Dryford, street level, a blue dot, moving inside the hospital. Evelyn looked at the map. The dot was in the east corridor, the wing that connected the main building to the rehabilitation center, a long connecting passage that was minimally staffed at this hour and had 3 external exits, 2 of which opened onto the back parking structure. "Whoever sent the text is in the building," she said, and moving toward the east exits. Whitfield was already speaking into his radio, low and fast, directing his people. He looked at Evelyn. "You know that corridor?" "Well enough." "Oh, is there a faster route than the main hall?" "Service corridor, west side of the pharmacy. Cuts 3 minutes off." He looked at her for 1 second, the look of a man making a quick calculation about what he was about to ask and whether it was appropriate. Then he made the call. "Show me," he said. She went. The service corridor was narrow and lit by fluorescent strips and smelled like industrial cleaning fluid and old pipe insulation. She moved through it at a pace that required Whitfield and his colleague to extend their strides to match, which neither of them complained about. She kept the layout in her head. Left at the junction near the boiler room, straight past the electrical closet, up the half flight of stairs to the connecting level, then right through the fire door into the east corridor. The fire door had a push bar and she hit it without slowing. The east corridor was long and wide, and painted the particular shade of institutional green that apparently no hospital designer had reconsidered since 1987. At this hour it was empty, lit every 30 feet by wall-mounted fixtures that left pools of shadow between them. At the far end, maybe 200 feet away, a figure was walking quickly toward the exit. Dark jacket, moving with purpose, not running because running would draw attention. "Stop," Whitfield said, loud enough to carry. The figure stopped, turned around. The face was familiar, and it took Evelyn 3 seconds to place it. And then she did, and the understanding hit with the particular cold weight of something that had been in front of her for a long time without being visible. It was Barry Sellers, the on-call administrator who had told her on the phone hours ago to just keep him calm, who had called Director Holt, who had access to every administrative system in the building, including pharmaceutical delivery scheduling, including contractor records from the 2022 renovation, including, she now understood, her personal personnel file, which contained her personal phone number. Barry Sellers was 43, soft-faced, the kind of man who had always seemed primarily concerned with not being noticed in a room. She had worked in this building with him for 6 years, and had formed no particular impression of him because he had cultivated exactly that. No impression. It was, she now understood, a professional skill. "Barry," she said. He looked at her, and what crossed his face was not guilt exactly. It was the expression of a man who had made a series of decisions he had convinced himself were manageable and was now in the moment where the consequences had a face. "Evelyn?" His voice was almost normal. I was trying to warn you. The text, I didn't want you to get... Put your hands where I can see them," Whitfield said. Barry's hands came up, slow. He was holding his phone in his right hand. I'm not involved in the distribution. I want you to understand that." He was talking faster now. "I knew about the storage arrangement. Holt brought me in 2 years ago, told me it was a controlled situation, that it was... I just looked the other way on some paperwork. I never touched product. I never knew about the network." "Mr. Sellers," Whitfield's colleague said, moving toward him with the particular deliberate pace of someone who had done this before. "I need you to stop talking and..." 3 days ago someone came to me," Barry said, talking over him. "Not Holt. Someone I'd never seen before. Told me to pull certain items from the secondary cabinet and move them. I didn't ask where." He looked at Evelyn with something desperate in his eyes. Not quite a plea, more like a man trying to hand off the weight of what he'd done to someone else just by making them understand the sequence. "I moved them to the rehab center storage, East Building, sublevel 1. They're still there. I was going to tell someone. I just needed to..." "Show us," Whitfield said. The sublevel of the rehabilitation center had a different quality from the rest of the hospital. Lower ceilings, unfinished walls, the kind of space that existed for mechanical purposes and storage, and was visited by as few people as possible. The elevator required a key card, which Barry provided with hands that were not entirely steady. The storage room was at the end of a short corridor behind a door marked physical therapy equipment. Surplus. Inside, stacked folding chairs, a broken treadmill, 3 rolling supply carts draped with tarps. Barry pointed at the carts without being asked. Whitfield's colleague lifted the nearest tarp. Medical packaging, marked with pharmaceutical lot numbers, quantity that, even to Evelyn's practiced eye, represented months of diverted controlled substance inventory, the kind of volume that answered a lot of questions about distribution scale. The woman with the tablet was already on her radio. Whitfield stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking at the carts, and then he looked at Barry Sellers, who had both hands in his jacket pockets, and the expression of someone who had just set down something very heavy and wasn't sure whether that made them feel better or worse. "Sit down," Whitfield said, pulling one of the folding chairs from a stack. Not unkindly, just factually. Barry sat. Evelyn stood in the doorway because the room was small and there were enough people in it. She was looking at the lot numbers on the packaging, and something was catching at her. The specific pharmaceutical markers on 2 of the packages were from a Fort Delancey distribution batch. She recognized the format because she'd spent 2 years handling exactly this type of packaging in exactly this inventory system. "Colonel?" She pointed without stepping into the room. Those two on the right. The batch codes. Those are military supply chain numbers. Whitfield crossed the room and looked where she was pointing. She watched his face. That's a 2017 batch, she said. From Delancey. He turned and looked at her, and for the first time tonight, she saw something in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration of a magnitude he hadn't anticipated. The kind that meant the shape of what he'd thought he was investigating had just become considerably larger. That's been sitting in a supply chain for 7 years, he said. Or it moved with the network when the network moved. She kept her voice even. When David Kane retired and relocated to Drayford. The room was quiet. Outside, she could hear rain on the small sub-level window above the stacked chairs. Barry Sellers was looking at the floor. Then Whitfield's radio cracked to life. His colleague in the ER, voice clipped and tight. Colonel, we have a situation upstairs. Marcus Kane attempted to leave the building and made contact with the officer in the parking lot, the one Hayes identified. They're inside now, main entrance, and Kane is armed, and he has a nurse. The next 3 words landed in the sub-level storage room like something physical. He has Danny. Evelyn was moving before Whitfield finished processing the transmission. She was already at the elevator, hitting the button, and when the doors didn't open fast enough, she turned to the stairwell and took it at a pace that wasn't quite running. Controlled, efficient, the kind of speed that didn't cost you stability. Whitfield was behind her. His colleagues stayed with Barry in the storage room, which was the right call, because the evidence didn't stop being evidence because something had gone wrong upstairs. The stairwell door opened into the main corridor, one junction from the ER entrance, and she stopped before she cleared the corner. She pressed herself flat against the wall and looked. The main entrance foyer was 40 feet away. Glass doors, waiting area visible through them, the overhead lights burning hard and white. Marcus Kane was standing near the reception desk with his weapon drawn and held low, not pointed at anyone specifically, but present in the room in a way that made everything else secondary. Beside him, close enough that the geometry was unmistakable, was Danny. Danny was on her feet, not physically restrained. Marcus wasn't holding her arm or gripping her jacket. She was standing next to him because the alternative, which was the service weapon 2 feet from her body, had communicated itself clearly enough. Her face was the particular blank of someone who had decided that stillness was the safest available option. She was doing well, actually. Better than many people would. The officer from the parking lot, mid-30s, Drayford PD uniform, a name tag that read Pellerin, was near the entrance doors, positioned to see both the foyer and the exterior. He was watching the corridor in the other direction, which meant he hadn't seen her yet. Whitfield materialized at her shoulder. She could feel him reading the room the same way she was. How many people in the foyer? He said, barely audible. Danny, Marcus, Pellerin at the door. I can see Renata behind the station. She's down, not hurt, probably told to stay. She paused. There's a patient family in the far waiting chairs, older couple. They haven't moved. My people are coming in from the ambulance bay. 2 minutes. 2 minutes is a long time. I know. She looked at Danny. 26 years old, terrible coffee, ponytail escaped from its elastic. Standing very still because she'd figured out that still was better than not still, which was smarter than a lot of people twice her age would have managed. He doesn't want a hostage, Evelyn said quietly. He wants leverage to walk out. That's not happening. I know. But he doesn't know what we have yet. He doesn't know about the sublevel. He doesn't know Barry talked. She kept her voice flat, just working the problem. He came back in because the parking lot officer told him something, probably that the exits were covered. He panicked and grabbed the nearest. She stopped, made herself say it plainly. He grabbed Danny because she was there. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking he knows me. Whatever else tonight has been, he's been watching me since he walked in. He'll talk to me. That's not a negotiation role I can formally. I know what it is, she said. Do you want to wait for your people or do you want this resolved? A beat. Don't make promises we can't keep. I don't make promises, she said, and stepped around the corner. Septipan. She walked into the foyer the way she'd walked into every difficult space tonight, without announcing herself, without performance, just present. She covered 15 feet before Pellerin turned and saw her, and by then she was already close enough that stopping felt more deliberate than continuing. "Hayes!" Marcus's voice. He'd seen her too. The weapon stayed low, but something shifted in his posture. Not relief, but a kind of redirected focus, like a man who'd been moving in a bad direction and had just found a fixed point. "Marcus?" She stopped 8 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough that nobody's instincts would misfire. Danny's eyes found hers. Evelyn gave the smallest possible nod, the one that meant, "I see you, I'm here, stay still." And Danny's shoulders dropped approximately 2 millimeters, which was enough. "I need to get out of this building," Marcus said. "I understand that." "Don't tell me you understand. Just—" He was working to keep the controlled version in place, and it was costing him. The uniform, the badge, the practiced authority, all of it was scaffolding tonight, and the scaffolding was shaking. "I need a vehicle, and I need the exits clear, and then this is over. If you walk out with a weapon drawn, it won't be over. You know that." "Better than staying." "Is it?" She kept her voice even, not challenging, genuinely asking, the kind of question that required a real answer. "What do you think is waiting for you outside?" He stared at her. "I've got people—" "Pellerin." She didn't look at the officer by the door. "He told you the exits were covered, which means he knew they were covered, which means he's been feeding someone information about this building tonight, and that someone knew an operation was running here. And the question you should be asking is whether he's actually here to help you or here to make sure you don't say anything you shouldn't." Pellerin moved. She caught it in her peripheral vision, a shift in weight, a hand moving toward his radio. And Marcus caught it too. He looked at Pellerin with the expression of a man rapidly recalculating a situation he thought he understood. "Pellerin," Marcus said. Pellerin stopped moving. "Who told you the exits were covered?" A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Dispatch." "Which dispatch?" Another pause. Marcus's face was doing the thing it had done down in the sublevel. The look of a person whose constructed version of a situation was coming apart and the real version was coming in ugly behind it. He was not, she was increasingly certain, the top of this. He was loud and brutal, and he had abused every ounce of authority he'd ever been handed, and he was also, at the bottom of it, someone who had been used and hadn't fully understood the extent of it until right now. That didn't make him safe. It made him unpredictable. "The federal agents in this building have everything," she said. And she said it quietly, directly to Marcus, like Pellerin wasn't in the room. "The storage room in the sublevel, the pharmaceutical logs. Barry Sellers gave a full statement 20 minutes ago." Marcus went very still. "Your father's supply chain, Marcus. The one that started at Fort Delancey in 2017. The one your brother was running street logistics for. The one that's been moving through this hospital for years with Holt and Sellers looking the other way." She paused. "They have all of it. Walking out of here with a weapon drawn doesn't change any of that." "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost something. "I filed the original report in 2017, she said, "at Fort Delancey. Your father buried it. His name is in the chain of command documentation that federal investigators have had for 8 months. She watched his face. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." The weapon was still in his hand, still low, but his grip had changed. "Let Danny walk to the station," she said. "Just that. Nothing else changes, nothing moves. Just let her walk." He looked at Danny, then at Evelyn. The scaffolding was coming down. She could see it, piece by piece. The particular collapse of a person who has organized their entire identity around a kind of power that has just been demonstrated to be borrowed, not owned. "Let her go," he said. Danny walked. She moved in the careful, measured way of someone who understood that the 30 feet between Marcus and the nurse's station was not a sure thing until it was a done thing, and she covered it without looking back. And when she reached the station, she put both hands flat on the counter and stood there, and Renata appeared from behind it and put a hand on her shoulder. 2 seconds later, Whitfield's people came through the ambulance bay. Marcus looked at the agents coming in and then back at Evelyn, and something happened in his face that she hadn't expected. Not the anger, not the authority, not the performance. Something stripped of all of that, a rawness that was almost worse to look at because it was so plainly human. He set the weapon on the floor. Pellerin ran. He made it 6 feet before 2 of Whitfield's agents cut off the corridor, and he stopped with his hands raised, still holding his radio, and the particular slumping of a man who had known this was the most likely outcome and had run anyway, because the body does what the body does. The next hour was controlled chaos of a different kind. The bureaucratic variety, which had its own rhythm and its own language and required a completely different set of skills. Evelyn gave it the same attention she gave everything. Marcus was cuffed and processed in the ER foyer with the kind of deliberate documented efficiency that federal operations brought to these moments. No dramatics, just the methodical machinery of accountability, the reading of rights, the securing of the weapon, the paperwork that would follow this for years. He went without further resistance, which surprised nobody more than it seemed to surprise him. Pellerin was handled separately, taken to a federal transport that had arrived in the ambulance bay while the foyer situation was resolving. His radio had been transmitting on a frequency that wasn't standard Dreyford PD dispatch, which answered the question Marcus had asked and hadn't gotten a real answer to. Danny was sitting in a trauma bay, not as a patient, just sitting on the edge of the bed with her shoes on the floor, holding a cup of water with both hands. Renata was with her. Evelyn looked in from the doorway. "You did well," she said. Danny looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't cried, which was a specific kind of hard thing. "I kept thinking about what you said. Stay still." "I didn't say that." "You nodded." Danny managed something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's the same thing." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. 26 years old, and she'd just stood in a room with a drawn weapon for 12 minutes and hadn't fallen apart. "Go home when they clear you," she said. "Sleep." "What about you?" "I have some things to finish first." She left the bay and found Whitfield near the entrance, where the activity was beginning to consolidate. Agents, paperwork, the organized aftermath of a scene that was closing down. The rain outside had not stopped. It had, if anything, gotten steadier, the kind of rain that had decided to be here for a while. "Pellerin's radio," she said. "Transmitting to a cell number registered to a logistics company," Whitfield said. "Kane Freight and Transport, David Kane's company." She had known it was coming. Knowing it didn't make it land any lighter. "He was listening," she said. "David Kane was monitoring tonight in real time. Has been for hours. We believe he knew about the operation before we deployed. Not the full scope, but enough to start moving pieces." Whitfield's voice was even, but there was a quality under it that she recognized as controlled anger, the kind that professional people kept in a specific internal compartment and used productively. "The inventory that was moved 3 days ago, we believe that was David Kane's direct order through Sellers once he had reason to think Cloverline was drawing federal attention. He sacrificed the Mercy Ridge operation to protect the larger network. That's our working theory, yes. Which means there are other locations. Which means there are other locations." He looked at her directly. "Which means tonight was significant, but it wasn't the end of it. The people above David Kane, the supply chain that started in theater and became Cloverline, they don't stop because we closed one hub." She processed that. Outside, one of the federal SUVs pulled out of the ambulance bay with Marcus Kane in the back seat, heading somewhere that wasn't here, somewhere that would take years to fully resolve. She watched it go. "Where is David Kane right now?" she said. "We issued the warrant 40 minutes ago. He's not at his registered address." Whitfield paused. "We'll find him." "How long has he known about me?" Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "The 2017 report had your name on it. He buried it, which means he read it. Whether he knew you were in Dreyford..." "The text from Barry's phone." She said it as she understood it. "Barry had my number from the personnel file, but someone told Barry to send it. Someone wanted me to know about the sublevel, wanted me to go looking, wanted me active and visible and moving through this building tonight while..." She stopped, ran it back. "While Marcus was in the parking lot with Pellerin, while David Kane was monitoring the frequency." Whitfield looked at her with the specific expression of a man who had reached the same conclusion 3 minutes ago and had been waiting to see if she'd get there. "Someone used Barry to move me," she said. "Yes." To get me away from the main floor, away from Marcus, away from the ER entrance. That's what it looks like. Which means someone wanted Marcus to have an opportunity to move without me in the room. She thought about the empty waiting chair, the 3 minutes she'd been in the parking lot. He almost made it. He didn't? Because Danny was there and he panicked. She heard the thinness of that margin and didn't pretend otherwise. That's not a plan working. That's a plan failing by accident. Whitfield didn't argue it. She was understanding, not the kind of person who argued things that were true. What I'm telling you, he said, is that David Kane knew you were in this building tonight. Knew your name, knew your history, knew you'd filed the 2017 report, and rather than running from that, he tried to use it. He paused. Which tells you something about how he thinks. It tells me he's not done. No, Whitfield said. He's not. Director Gerald Holt was escorted out of the building at 4:15 in the morning, and Evelyn watched it happen from the station. He walked with his head down, not the shame posture exactly, more the posture of a man conserving something, keeping his eyes away from the places where people were watching. He had cooperated fully with Whitfield's team, which would matter in rooms she would never be present in, and which did not change what he had done or how long he had done it. As he passed the station, he stopped, looked at her. His reading glasses were still on the chain around his neck, the one real version of himself that had persisted through everything tonight. I want you to know, he started. You don't need to, she said. I want to. He swallowed. I told myself it was administrative, that I was just managing paperwork, that the medical side, the patients, the clinical decisions, I kept it separate in my mind. He stopped. I understand now that that's not a real distinction. She looked at him and thought about what she wanted to say and decided on the truth, which was, 12 people came through those doors tonight because of a crash connected to your building's supply chain. One of them was 9 years old. She held his gaze. Whether or not you saw yourself in it, you were in it. Holt looked like a man who wanted to say something else and understood that anything he said would make it worse. He walked out. She went back to work. There were still patients in this building. The thoracic case in Bay 1 needed a morning specialist consult documented. The step-down patients needed handoff notes. The 9-year-old upstairs needed someone to follow up with pediatric ortho about his fracture timeline. These were not dramatic tasks. They were not the tasks of this kind of night. But they were the work, and the work was the work. And she knew from long experience that the moments after high-stakes situations were precisely the moments when routine discipline mattered most, because adrenaline did not make you accurate, and the come-down was when mistakes happened. So she documented. She made calls. She completed what needed completing. At 5:40 in the morning, with the rain still going outside and the overnight staff beginning to overlap with the early day shift, Whitfield appeared at the station one last time. We need your formal statement on record, he said. Full scope, 2017 through tonight. It'll take most of a day, and I want you to have counsel present if you want it. I don't need counsel. You might want it anyway. She considered it. Tomorrow afternoon, after I sleep. Fair. He set a card on the station. Then he set a second document beside it, so a single page, official letterhead, with several lines of text and a signature she didn't recognize. That's a formal notice of cooperation status in the Cloverline investigation. It also references the 2017 report and its suppression, and acknowledges that the original filing was accurate and properly submitted. He paused. It won't undo the years, but it exists now, officially, in a federal record. She picked it up, read it. It was exactly what he'd said it was. Spare language, no decoration, just the plain documented fact that she had been right and someone had made sure it hadn't mattered. She set it down. Thank you, she said. Not effusively, just thank you. He nodded once, picked up his jacket, and walked toward the entrance. His team was already at the vehicles, the operation winding down, the scene transferred, the next phase of a long and complicated case beginning somewhere else. She looked at the document on the station. Then she put it in her bag, picked up the next chart, and kept working. The day shift supervisor arrived at 6 and took the floor, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who had been briefed in the parking lot by a federal agent and was processing it in real time. Evelyn gave her the full handoff. Clean, complete, every patient documented, every pending task noted, twice as thorough as normal because the night had been twice as disruptive, and the people coming onto this floor deserved to start from a solid foundation regardless of what had happened in the hours before. She was at her locker at 6:20 when her phone rang. Not the unknown 615 number. Her sister, calling from Portland, which was unusual enough at this hour that she answered. "I saw the news alerts," her sister said without preamble. "There's a thing about Mercy Ridge, federal investigation, multiple arrests. They're not naming the hospital staff, but..." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." Evelyn. "I'm fine, Claire. I've been at work." A longer pause. "You sound like you." "I am me." "I mean, you sound like the other you, the you from before." She thought about what to say to that. The you from before. Her sister's shorthand for the version of her that had existed in uniform, that had operated in conditions that required a particular kind of self that Claire had never been entirely comfortable with and had never stopped being worried about. "Go back to sleep," she said. "I'll call you this weekend." She hung up. Stood in front of the open locker for a moment. The photograph was still taped to the inside door. The group in desert uniforms, squinting in sunlight. She looked at it for the first time in a long time, really looked at it, instead of seeing it as furniture. 7 people in the photo. She was on the far left. Second from the right was a man she'd served with for 2 years who had, she now understood, reported to a chain of command that included a captain who was moving product through their own supply line. She wondered how much he'd known. She wondered if she'd ever know. She closed the locker. She walked out of the staff room through the ER, which was already picking up the rhythm of early morning, new patients, new problems, the shift change activity that meant the building was cycling into its next version of itself, and out through the main entrance. The rain had stopped. The air was the clean cold of a morning that had washed everything down, the sky still dark at the edges but beginning to differentiate at the eastern horizon. She stood for a moment outside the entrance, and the stillness was the same stillness she always carried. Not peace exactly, but the absence of pretense, the exact shape of things, without the noise. Her phone buzzed. A text from Whitfield. David Kane's vehicle located, Dryford Regional Airport, long-term lot. He left 4 hours ago. We're running the manifest. She read it twice. Then a second text, 30 seconds later, from a number she didn't recognize, but that began with a different area code than the last unknown number. A 901 this time. He didn't go alone. Check who filed the original complaint against you with the hospital board tonight. It wasn't Marcus. She stood outside Mercy Ridge Medical Center in the cold, early morning air, with the document in her bag and the night behind her and the work of what came next still entirely ahead, and she read the text a second time. Check who filed the original complaint against you with the hospital board tonight. It wasn't Marcus. The complaint, the one that had brought Holt out of bed at 11:15, the call that Barry had made, the chain that had put her in the corridor with Holt at exactly the moment the mass casualty response began, the moment when someone who understood this hospital's systems would have known the floor would be chaotic and the secondary access corridor would be unmonitored. She had assumed Marcus filed it. Marcus, in his rage, calling in his connections. She pulled up the hospital's administrative complaint portal on her phone. She had access. She was charge nurse, and navigated to that night's board communications log. The complaint had been filed at 10:47. Marcus had arrived at the hospital at 11:03. 16 minutes before he walked through the doors, someone had already filed a complaint against her with the board. Someone who knew she was working tonight, knew her name and her role, and wanted her removed from the floor before Marcus arrived. Someone who had been setting this up before Marcus even left his house. She stood in the cold morning air and looked at the name attached to the complaint submission. It wasn't a name she recognized, but the staff ID number beside it, the system-generated identifier that every Mercy Ridge employee carried, belonged to someone who had been terminated from Mercy Ridge Medical Center 8 months ago. Someone whose termination had been signed off by Gerald Holt. Someone who, according to the employment record that was now populating on her screen, had worked in pharmaceutical supply chain management, and whose emergency contact listed at the bottom of the HR file, mandatory field, never removed from the system after termination, was David Kane. The name in the emergency contact field was David Kane, and the employee it belonged to was a man named Preston Wald. She stood in the cold outside Mercy Ridge and ran the employment record again, making sure she was reading it correctly, because misreading something at 6:20 in the morning after a 15-hour shift was entirely possible, and she was not in the business of acting on partial information. But it read the same way the second time. Preston Wald, terminated 8 months ago. Pharmaceutical supply chain coordinator, emergency contact David Kane, and his staff ID number had been used, tonight at 10:47, to file a complaint against her with the hospital board. A terminated employee whose access should have been revoked the day Holt signed the paperwork, whose credentials were apparently still live in the system. She forwarded the HR file screenshot to Whitfield's number without composing a message. He would understand what he was looking at. 30 seconds later, her phone buzzed. On it. Don't go anywhere. She went back inside. Not to the ER. The day shift had the floor and it didn't need her. She went to the administrative wing, which at 6:20 in the morning was empty and dark, the kind of institutional quiet that only existed in the hours before the building's bureaucratic layer woke up. She used her charge nurse credentials to access the HR system terminal in the staff services office, a small room off the main admin corridor that she'd been in maybe 3 times in 6 years, usually to update her direct deposit information. Preston Wald's access credentials had never been deactivated. The system showed them as active. The last login before tonight was 8 months ago, the day before his termination date, and then nothing until 10:43 tonight, when someone had logged in from an internal terminal and used his credentials to file the board complaint. Internal terminal, not remote access. Someone had been inside this building tonight, before Marcus Kane arrived, using a dead employee's login to set up the conditions for what followed. She pulled the terminal access log. The login at 10:43 had originated from Terminal 7 in the administrative wing. She was in the administrative wing. She looked up from the screen. Terminal 7 was 4 desks to her left. She walked to it. The screen was dark, the keyboard clean, nothing obviously disturbed. But on the floor beside the chair, barely visible against the dark carpeting, was a lanyard, the kind hospital visitors were issued at the front desk. A yellow visitor badge, the disposable paper kind that printed automatically and expired at midnight. She picked it up. The name printed on it was Wayne Fuller. The check-in time was 9:58 p.m. The department listed was Administration Parcel Contractor. She photographed it, sent it to Whitfield, and then she sat in the chair next to Terminal 7 and thought, Wayne Fuller. Not a name from the HR system, not a name she recognized from any contractor list she'd seen, but someone with enough knowledge of Mercy Ridge's administrative structure to know that Terminal 7 existed, that Preston Wald's credentials were still live, and that filing a complaint through the board portal at the right time would pull Holt out of bed and put pressure on a specific nurse at a specific moment. David Kane had planned tonight, not reactively, not as a response to the federal operation. He had known the operation was coming, and he had built a parallel track that used this hospital, used Marcus, used her history, and was designed to create enough noise and disruption that the real movement, the inventory transfer out of the sublevel, the product that had already been moved 3 days prior, could happen in the chaos. Marcus hadn't been the architect. He'd been the noise. She sat with that for a moment, and it didn't make her feel anything in particular about Marcus, because he had still done every brutal thing he'd done, and intent and outcome were different categories. But it clarified something about the shape of the night. She had spent hours reading this situation as Marcus's operation and Marcus's power. And Marcus was loud enough and aggressive enough that she'd never questioned whether he was the loudest thing in the room. He wasn't. He'd never been. He was a weapon someone else had pointed. Her phone rang. Whitfield. Wayne Fuller is an alias, he said, before she could speak. We're running the visitor log against facial recognition from the entrance camera. Fuller checked in at 9:58, checked out at 11:30. He was in the building during the mass casualty response. A pause. He had a full hour in the admin wing while every person in this hospital was focused on the ER. But he moved the inventory 3 days ago, she said, and tonight he came back to close the loop, make sure the credentials were used, make sure the complaint was filed, make sure the board called Holt, make sure the pressure landed on the right person at the right time. That's the architecture, yes. Whitfield's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that had been building through the night. David Kane ran this from a distance and used his sons as the local presence. Marcus made the noise. Danny was the courier. Preston Wald was the inside contact until he got too exposed and Holt terminated him, probably at Kane's direction, to create a firewall. Except Holt kept the credentials live. Because Kane told him to, in case they were needed. A long pause. Preston Wald is at a location in East Drayford that we've had under surveillance for 6 weeks. He doesn't know we know where he is. We're moving on him now. She looked at the visitor badge in her hand. Wayne Fuller, 9:58 p.m., administration, contractor. A paper badge that was supposed to expire at midnight and instead had sat on the floor next to Terminal 7 like a receipt. David Kane, she said. The airport. Manifest has him on a connecting flight through Memphis, final destination not yet confirmed. We have a federal hold on him. He won't clear any domestic airport. Whitfield paused. He's not going anywhere. She set the badge on the desk. How long until you have him? Hours. Maybe less. He paused. Evelyn, go home. You've done everything that can be done tonight. She looked at the dark administrative wing, the row of silent terminals, the framed hospital mission statement on the wall that she had never once read in 6 years of walking past it. The building felt different at this hour, not smaller, but more honest. Without the daylight and the noise and the performance of institutional normalcy, it was just walls and systems, and the accumulated weight of everything that had passed through it. Okay, she said. She drove home as the sun came up. Ote. She slept for 9 hours without dreaming, which was unusual. She woke at 4 in the afternoon to 17 text notifications. 3 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. 1 missed call from her sister Claire, and a voicemail from Whitfield that was 40 seconds long and which she listened to twice sitting on the edge of her bed in the afternoon light. David Kane had been detained at Memphis International Airport at 9:15 that morning when a federal hold flagged his connecting flight. He had not resisted. He was in federal custody and had made no statement. Preston Wald had been arrested at the East Drayford location at 7:40 a.m. Wayne Fuller, real name Leonard Grasso, former military logistics officer with a service record that intersected with Fort Delancey during exactly the right years, was in custody in Nashville, where he had apparently been heading when the federal net caught him. The Cloverline network, Whitfield said at the end of the voicemail, was not completely dismantled. These things never were, not in one night. But its operational infrastructure in the Drayford region was gone, and the evidentiary record assembled between the sub-level storage room, the pharmaceutical logs, Barry Sellers' statement, and the administrative terminal access data was, in his measured professional assessment, comprehensive. She played the voicemail a third time, not because she'd missed anything, but because she wanted to hear it as a complete thing. Then she called her sister. I'm fine, she said before Claire could ask. You said you'd call this weekend. It is the weekend. It's Saturday afternoon. A pause. It's Friday. Then I'm early. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her window, the light coming through it long and low. I'm fine, Claire, I promise. Can you tell me what happened? She thought about how to answer that. The true version was long and would require explanations that would raise more questions than they answered. And her sister had spent years building a careful distance from the part of Evelyn that operated in these kinds of situations, the part that Claire called the other you. Not with judgment, exactly, but with the protective instinct of someone who loved a person they didn't entirely know how to reach. Something I started a long time ago got finished, she said. A very long pause. Are you okay with that? She sat with the question. The honest answer was that she didn't know yet. That the finishing of things didn't always feel the way you expected, and that 7 years was a long time to carry the particular weight of a report that someone decided didn't matter, and that the removal of that weight would probably have a texture she hadn't fully felt yet. I think so, she said. I'll know better in a few days. Come visit, Claire said. Not this weekend, whenever. Just come. Okay, she said, and she meant it. The formal statement took all of the following Monday and most of Tuesday. Whitfield had an entire team in a conference room in the federal building downtown. Not beige like the Mercy Ridge one, but the particular austere gray of federal architecture. And they went through everything in sequence: the 2017 report, the chain of command, what she had been told, what she had observed, every patient interaction, every exchange with Marcus, every decision she had made during the mass casualty response, the pharmaceutical logs, the sublevel, the confrontation in the foyer, the visitor badge, the administrative terminal. It was the most complete accounting of anything she had ever given, and it took until 4 p.m. on Tuesday to finish. At the end of the second day, a woman she hadn't seen before came into the conference room. 50s, sharp suit, the carriage of someone who had spent decades in rooms where decisions had consequences. She introduced herself as Assistant U.S., Attorney Diane Morrow. "I want to be direct with you about where this goes," Morrow said, settling into the chair across the table. "Marcus Kane faces charges of aggravated assault, unlawful restraint, obstruction of federal investigation, and knowing participation in a criminal enterprise. The evidence is substantial. His attorney has already opened cooperation discussions, which tells you something about how they're reading the situation. What about David Kane? Federal conspiracy, drug trafficking, distribution of controlled substances, obstruction of justice, and suppression of a government report. The 2017 filing. That last one is going to be an interesting legal argument, and we intend to make it loudly." Morrow looked at her steadily. "Your original report is central to the conspiracy case. It establishes the origin point of the network, the mechanism of suppression, and the chain of decisions that followed. Without it, Cloverline has no documented beginning. With it, we have a 7-year arc that connects Fort Delancey to a federal hospital drug diversion scheme." "So the report matters now," Evelyn said. "The report always mattered. It was deliberately prevented from mattering." Morrow paused. "That distinction is important, and the court record will reflect it." Evelyn looked at the table. The case files spread across it. 7 years of paper, reduced to exhibits and case numbers and the clean terminology of federal prosecution. She thought about being 27 years old and writing that report with careful hands and trusting that the process worked. And she thought about what it had cost to carry the knowledge that it didn't. Not loudly, not in any way she had ever shown anyone, just quietly, in the way that certain things you learn about the world settle into you and change the shape of how you move through it. "I'd like a copy of the original report," she said. "The one I filed. Not the filed version, the original." Morrow looked at her for a moment. "We can arrange that." She nodded once. "Then we're done." Mercy Ridge issued a public statement on the Wednesday following, 9 days after the night that had upended it. Evelyn read it on her phone in her apartment, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee that was actually good this time. She'd bought a new bag at the market, the real kind. And the statement was careful and institutional, and said the things that statements said. The hospital cooperated fully with the federal investigation. It was committed to patient safety and staff welfare. It was conducting an internal review of administrative practices and procurement procedures. Buried in the fourth paragraph was a sentence acknowledging that nursing staff had performed with exceptional professionalism during the mass casualty response of the preceding week. She appreciated the acknowledgement for what it was, which was minimal, and moved on. The hospital board called her that afternoon. Not Gerald Holt. Holt was in a very different kind of meeting, but the board chair, a woman named Patricia Solano, who spoke with the careful warmth of someone who understood that a phone call was not sufficient for what had occurred but was trying anyway. "The board wants to meet with you," Solano said. "In person, this week if possible. There are several things we need to address formally." "I'm available Thursday," Evelyn said. The Thursday meeting was in the boardroom on the 5th floor, which Evelyn had never been in before. Long table, leather chairs, framed photographs of the hospital's previous incarnations going back to its founding in 1961. 6 board members, Solano at the head, and a hospital attorney whose presence was either routine or protective and probably both. They offered her the apology first, which she thought was probably the attorney's recommendation. Get the liability adjacent item on the record early. Solano read it from a prepared statement and then set it down and said, more plainly, "What was done to you during that shift? The pressure to step back, the call to the administrator, the way your authority was undermined in front of your staff, that was wrong. Not just procedurally. It was wrong. Evelyn looked at her. I know. We want to do something meaningful in response, not a gesture. Then don't make it one. A brief pause around the table. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She was trying to make sure they understood that she was not a person who could be managed with the right tone and a framed certificate. If they wanted to do something, they needed to mean it, and the way you found out if an institution meant something was to hold the space and see what they put in it. Solano looked at the board members on either side of her, then back at Evelyn. We want to create a formal trauma preparedness and emergency response program for nursing staff, structured curriculum, clinical simulations, mass casualty protocols, housed inside the ER and run by someone who understands both the medical and tactical dimensions of large-scale emergency response. She paused. We want you to build it and run it. Evelyn sat with that. Not a title that meant nothing. Not a symbolic promotion that kept her at arm's length from actual decisions. A program. Something that didn't exist yet, that would have to be built from nothing, that would require the kind of work she was actually good at, which was not performing authority but exercising it in the specific, granular, detail-level way that changed how people operated in crisis. She thought about the mass casualty response 10 days ago, the residents who had frozen, the nurses who hadn't known where the backup crash cart was, the staff who had looked at her for direction, not because she had asked them to, but because she had simply known what to do and done it, and the room had oriented to that the way rooms always oriented to clarity in the absence of it. She thought about being 27 years old and trusting a process that someone else corrupted. And she thought about what it would mean to build something that had her name on it. Not her rank, not her history, just her name and the work she knew how to do. I have conditions, she said. Solano nodded. Of course. The program is clinically independent. I report to the chief medical officer, not administration. Purchasing, staffing, and curriculum decisions are mine. We can agree to that. I want 2 dedicated simulation spaces in the ER rebuild, not shared rooms, dedicated. The current crash cart system gets overhauled before we run a single training session, and every nurse who was on floor the night of the incident gets first enrollment, on paid time, no exceptions. The attorney made a note. Solano was looking at her with something in her expression that Evelyn identified, after a moment, as relief. Not the relief of crisis averted, but the relief of finding that a person you owe something to is telling you exactly what that something is. Done, Solano said. Evelyn looked at the framed photographs of the hospital going back 60 years. All the iterations of this building, all the hands that had worked in it, all the decisions that had been made in rooms not unlike this one that determined what kind of place it would be for the people who depended on it. Institutions were not buildings. They were the accumulated weight of choices. Then I accept, she said. The sentencing phase of what the federal case became known as, in the clean shorthand of court documents, as U.S. versus Kane et al., took the better part of 2 years to resolve, because federal cases were not built for speed, and because David Kane's defense attempted 17 procedural motions before the trial began, all of which failed, and because the evidentiary record was dense enough that simply entering it took weeks. Marcus Kane pled guilty to aggravated assault, unlawful restraint, and obstruction charges 11 months after his arrest, in exchange for cooperation in the larger conspiracy case against his father. He received 4 years in federal custody. His badge was surrendered the day of his arraignment, and the Drayford Police Department initiated a full internal review that removed 3 officers connected to the Cloverline network, including Pellerin, who cooperated quickly and completely, and whose testimony closed several evidentiary gaps that the prosecution had been working around. David Kane went to trial. He did not cooperate. He maintained through 17 months of proceedings and a legal team that had clearly been prepared before the arrest, that the supply chain had operated without his knowledge, that his name in Preston Wald's emergency contact field was a personal relationship unrelated to any criminal activity, and that the suppression of the 2017 report had been an administrative decision made by others. The jury took 11 hours. Guilty on all counts. Federal conspiracy, drug trafficking, obstruction of a federal investigation, and the count that U.S. Attorney Morrow had called an interesting legal argument and had made loudly, knowing suppression of a government report in furtherance of criminal enterprise. 22 years. Evelyn was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She was in the simulation space on the ground floor of the rebuilt Mercy Ridge ER, running a mass casualty drill with 14 nurses and 3 residents, all of them moving through a scenario she'd designed based on the Route 9 response, all of them making the decisions that she'd had to make alone on a Tuesday night that felt, at this distance, like something that had happened to a slightly different version of herself. Her phone buzzed on the table outside the simulation space. She glanced at it between stations. Whitfield's name, a text, verdict in. All counts, 22 years. She set the phone down and went back into the simulation. Bay 2 is losing pressure, she said, to the resident managing the scenario. You have 30 seconds and you're short 1 nurse. What do you do? The resident looked at the scenario board. He was 28, knew enough to be scared of being wrong, experienced enough to make himself think anyway. He made a call. It was a reasonable call, not the call she would have made, but reasonable. And she told him why it was reasonable, and why it wasn't the right one, and what the right one was, and he listened with the specific attention of someone who understood that this information was going to matter in a real room someday. After the drill, when the residents and nurses were debriefing in small groups, Danny appeared in the doorway of the simulation space. She was in her 2nd year now, had been offered a lead triage position on the overnight rotation, and had accepted it with the particular combination of confidence and honest nervousness that Evelyn respected more than false certainty. Did you see the verdict? Danny asked. I saw. How do you feel about it? It was the kind of question that Danny asked more easily than most people, which was one of the things about her that Evelyn had come to appreciate, the directness without aggression, the genuine curiosity without pressure. She thought about the honest answer. How did she feel about 22 years for David Kane, 4 years for Marcus, federal charges for Holt and Sellers and Grasso and Wald, the Drayford PD internal review, the 2 years of process that had converted a night of chaos into a documented, adjudicated, permanent record? Tired, she said. And okay. Danny nodded slowly. Not like triumphant or whatever? Not really, no. She looked at the simulation space, the crash cart she'd specified, the monitoring equipment, the scenario boards on the wall. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like the thing that should have happened eventually happened. 7 years late. Yes. Danny leaned in the doorway for a moment. Do you think they knew? The people who buried the report? Do you think they knew what it would cost? Evelyn had thought about this. She'd thought about it on the drive home from Fort Delancey in 2017, and she'd thought about it in the years after, and she'd thought about it with new texture since the night that had unraveled everything. The question of whether people who made corrosive choices understood the weight of them, or whether they moved through those choices the way Gerald Holt had moved through his, by keeping categories separate in their minds, by deciding that what they were doing was administrative, not real. I think they knew enough, she said, and chose not to know the rest. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, that's the scariest version. Yes, Evelyn said. It is, or the program became, in its 2nd year, something larger than she'd designed it to be. 3 other hospitals in the state contacted Mercy Ridge asking about the curriculum. The state health department sent 2 representatives to observe a simulation drill. A nursing journal published a piece on the program's mass casualty framework that used language she had written in her original program proposal, cited and attributed her name in print for work she had done rather than for anything that had been done to her. She trained 49 nurses and 11 residents in the first 18 months. She rewrote the crash cart protocols for the entire building. She built a rapid response decision tree that Mercy Ridge now used as its standard emergency escalation guide, laminated and posted in every trauma bay, replacing the outdated version that had been there since 2014 and which she had privately thought was inadequate for years without ever having the platform to change it. The platform was the thing. She understood that now, not bitterly, but with the specific clarity that came from having been on both sides of it. The absence of platform didn't mean the absence of capability. It meant the capability went unused, and the waste of that was not just personal. It was systemic. It accumulated. It showed up in crisis moments as the difference between a floor that held and a floor that didn't. She had been capable on the night of the Route 9 response, not because of anything that happened that night, but because of everything that had been built in the years before it. The deployments, the training, the quiet discipline of someone who had kept her skills intact, even when the environment she worked in didn't value or see them. And the program she was building now was, at its foundation, a refusal to let that calculus repeat. Every nurse who came through the simulation space left knowing that their competence was documented, developed, and institutionally recognized, not because they had performed under duress, but because someone had invested in them before the duress arrived. That was the point. That was what she was doing with the years. On a Thursday in late October, 2 years and 4 months after the night that changed the shape of things, she was running a solo calibration on the new simulation equipment when Dr. Okafor came into the space. They had developed, over the past 2 years, something that didn't have a neat name, a working relationship that had grown into mutual respect, that had grown into something close to friendship, defined mostly by the fact that they could sit in silence together without either of them finding it uncomfortable. He sat on the edge of the scenario table and watched her run the equipment check. "Press conference at 4, he said. "Board wants you there." "I know." "The state health department is naming the program as a model curriculum." "I know, Kwame." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to make a speech, are you?" "I'm going to say thank you and sit down." "Good." He paused. "You know they're going to try to give you a framed thing." "I'll put it in the office." "You'll put it in a drawer." She didn't answer, which was its own answer, and he half smiled at his shoes. She finished the equipment check and made her notes, and then she stood in the simulation space for a moment, just standing in it, looking at what it was. The crash cart with the correct medications in the correct configuration, the monitoring equipment with the updated protocols taped cleanly to the side, the scenario boards, the supply labels that she had personally redone when the originals were wrong in her first week, because wrong labels were how people grabbed the wrong thing under pressure, and the wrong thing under pressure was how people died. None of it was glamorous. None of it was the kind of thing that made for clean narrative. The hard work of building systems, the revisions, the training sessions that went poorly and had to be redesigned, the meetings with administrators about budget lines for equipment she'd had to fight for. It was granular and incremental, and it was, she understood, what she had always been built for. Not the crisis. The crisis was what you managed when the preparation failed. What she was built for was the preparation. The quiet work that meant the floor held. She had been, for years, a person that an institution had underestimated because she hadn't made them see her. And she had learned something from that. Not that she needed to be louder, but that there was a particular cost to deliberately disappearing, to choosing invisibility as a form of protection. It had protected her from things she'd needed protection from. And it had also meant that the work she did existed in a vacuum, unconnected from any larger purpose, unrecognized by the people around her, not feeding anything that outlasted the shift. The program was different. It was visible. It had her name on it, and her methods in it, and it was training people who would train other people. And the 2017 report that had been buried was now a federal exhibit in a landmark narcotics suppression case, cited in law review articles, referenced in a congressional subcommittee testimony about military supply chain oversight that happened 6 months ago, and which she had submitted a written statement for. She had not fixed the thing that was broken. She had never been in a position to fix it alone, and that was the truth that certain stories obscured in favor of a cleaner arc, the part where one person's rectitude was sufficient, where the right amount of competence or courage or endurance could substitute for functional systems and accountable institutions. That wasn't how it worked. What she had done was hold on to the accurate record of what she had witnessed and refuse to revise it to make it comfortable, and be present in the building on the night when the system finally turned enough in the right direction to catch what she was throwing at it. That was all. That was not nothing. The press conference was in the hospital atrium at 4, under the renovated skylights that the administration had installed as part of the rebuilding. She stood at the back while Patricia Solano spoke about the program. And Dr. Okafor made a brief remark about clinical excellence, and the state health department representative said the things that state representatives said. There were cameras, there were board members, there were nurses from her program standing near the front, and she saw Danny near the left side in her lead triage badge, and Danny caught her eye and gave a small nod that said, "I see you standing at the back on purpose, and I also see you." When Solano gestured for her to come forward, she walked to the front and stood in the light from the skylights and looked at the room. All these people. Nurses she had trained, doctors she had worked beside, board members who had needed a crisis to see what had been in this building for 6 years. Cameras that were there because a story about justice in a hospital made better copy than the actual work of keeping people alive, which happened every day in this building without acknowledgement, which was the correct ratio. The acknowledgement should not be the point of the work, and the work did not require the acknowledgement to be real. But this was real too. Standing here was real. Having her name on something built to last was real. The faces of the nurses who had come through the simulation space and were better prepared than they had been before, so that was real, and it was the kind of real that persisted past the moment. She looked at the room. "I started in this department 6 years ago," she said, "and I was good at my job in a building that didn't know it. That's not a complaint. That's just what happens when systems don't have good ways of seeing the people inside them." She paused. This program is an attempt to build a better way of seeing, not the nurses who perform well in a crisis. That's too late. The nurses who are prepared for the crisis before it arrives. The ones whose skills exist and are documented and are cultivated before anything goes wrong. She looked at the faces she knew. That's the work. Everything else is consequence. She stepped back. Solano handed her a framed certificate with the program's name on it. Hayes Emergency Preparedness and Trauma Curriculum, Mercy Ridge Medical Center. And she accepted it and looked at it and held it in both hands. And for a moment she was back in the corridor at Fort Delancey in 2017, 27 years old, handing a report to a man whose job was to receive it, trusting that it would go where it needed to go. It had gone somewhere. It had just taken a long time, and a lot of damage, and a Tuesday night in Drayford, and a 9-year-old boy with a fractured arm, and a 26-year-old nurse who stood very still in a room with a drawn weapon because someone had taught her that stillness was a skill. After the press conference, she took the certificate to her office and put it on the wall. Not in a drawer. On the wall, where she could see it from the desk where she wrote the curriculum that would outlast this conversation, this building, this version of herself. Where it would be visible to every nurse who came into that office to ask her a question about the work, which happened often now, and which she had come to understand was not interruption but the actual thing, the transfer of what she knew to the people who would use it, the work continuing past her, the preparation running ahead of the crisis the way preparation was supposed to. She sat at the desk. She picked up the next file. She worked.